On May 14, 1898, the U.S. Congress extended the Homestead Act of 1862 to Alaska. This safeguarded all of London's interests into building a railroad from Skagway, Alaska, into the Yukon. That same day, the Close brothers in London gave their approval to proceed with the construction of the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad. Contractor Michael J. Haney immediately began confirming previous orders for supplies and equipment to build the impossible railroad. "5 days after this approval, the steamers City of Seattle and Utopia were dispatched to Skagway with hundreds of men and hundreds of tons of supplies and equipment. Construction of the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad officially began on Saturday, May 28, 1898. Supplies were hauled up from the beaches with horses and wagons, and construction camps were quickly set up at the north end of town. Squatters occupying the east side of the valley on White Pass property refused to move. It took over 2 weeks for the city of Skagway to grant the railroad a temporary right-of-way up Broadway. Frustrated by the long delay for an agreement from the city, tracks were laid up Broadway just after midnight in the wee hours of the morning on June 15, 1898. The railway's first 2 locomotives were built in 1881 by the Brooks Locomotive Works in Dunkirk, New York. The locomotives were built for the Utah Northern Railroad, who later sold them to the Columbia and Puget Sound Railway in 1890. Designated number 2, the first locomotive to arrive in Skagway, was purchased by White Pass for $3,000. It was shipped north along with a tender and 2 flat cars in July of 1898. On Wednesday, July 20th, locomotive number 2 was unceremoniously fired up and sent puffing up Broadway towards the construction front, hauling 2 flat cars loaded with timbers and railway iron. The following day, engine number 2 pulled its first excursion train, consisting of 2 flat cars fitted with rows of wooden benches. Aboard were many of Skagway's leading citizens and guests, who were offered a complimentary ride. When it was not being used to supply materials for the construction site, Number 2 hauled passenger excursion trains to the end of steel. New passenger cars, additional locomotives, and building materials arrived in September. These passenger cars were quickly put into service. Competing with the bracket wagon road, White Pass hauled passengers and freight to the end of construction on a daily basis. Excursion passengers marveled at the hanging rocks of Clifton at 8.5 Mile. 5 trains a day delivered freight and passengers to Haney Station at 12.4 mile. Here the freight was lowered down to White Pass City, where it was transferred to independent packers who hauled the freight over the pass and beyond. Rails finally reached Lake Bennett on July 6, 1899. A ceremonial spike was driven to the sounds of a cheering crowd and steamboat whistles. At Lake Bennett, scows were built to haul equipment and material to Carcross to continue laying rails onto Whitehorse. Permafrost in the ground was the only major obstacle encountered in this second phase of construction. Rails in the number 2 steam locomotive reached Whitehorse on June 8, 1900. They were followed by a short spike driving ceremony. The third phase of construction, along the shore between Lake Bennett and Carcross, was proceeding at a blistering rate. Track laying crews reached Carcross where the Golden Spike was driven on July 29, 1900. The impossible railroad was now complete. In 1900, number 2, now renamed 52, and its sister locomotive, the 51, were both rebuilt in the Skagway shops with larger Baldwin boilers and steam cylinders. This added more power to the locomotives. Each of their cabs were rebuilt to fit the larger boilers. In June 1900, White Pass and Yukon Route purchased the Atlan's Shortline Railway and Navigation Company, also known as the Taku Tram. This 2¼ mile line ran between Scotia Bay on Atlan Lake and Taku City on Tagish Lake. The Duchess, a 260 saddle tank locomotive built by the Dunsmuir, Diggle and Company in 1878, was delivered to the Taku Tram in July of 1900. In 1920, Locomotive 51 was shipped to Taku to replace the Duchess. Between 1900 and 1931, the 52 worked in the yard and continued to pull trains with mining equipment and supplies for the Yukon. In 1931, the 52 was shipped to Taku to replace its sister locomotive, the 51. Retired from service in 1936, the 52 sat on a spur in Taku, British Columbia, as a small tourist attraction. Over time, the 52 was slowly overtaken by trees and weeds. Citizens of Skagway had not forgotten about their first locomotive. In the early 1960s, a group of Skagway residents, businesses, and employees of the railroad organized and raised money to bring the 52 back to Skagway. This was the beginning of Project 52. A construction company from Whitehorse was hired to move the equipment from Taku. Steel skids were built for the tender and small four-wheeled flat car. On Saturday, March 6, 1964, a D4 Cat pulled them over the abandoned right-of-way to Scotia Bay and then across the lake to Atlin. On Sunday, March 7th, the crew returned to Taku to weld rails onto the skids and prepare the 52 for the move. On Monday, March 8th, the 52 made its last trip over the Atlin Southern route and crossed the ice to Atlin, where it joined the tender and flat car. A small plane overhead kept track of the move. The next day, the 52 was loaded on a lowboy trailer in Atlin and trucked over the Alaska Highway to Railhead in Whitehorse. On Tuesday, March 9th, the 52 was placed back on White Pass rails in Whitehorse, joined by the tender and flat car the very next day. In Whitehorse, the axles and bearings were greased on the 52 and tender, preparing them for the trip home. On Saturday, March 13th, a volunteer train crew from Skagway arrived in Whitehorse. The following day, on the trip south, the 52 stopped at Carcross to say hello to its old friend, the Duchess. The 52 arrived home in Skagway on the afternoon of Sunday, March 14, 1964. The first steam locomotive to arrive in Skagway seems quite small compared to a modern diesel locomotive, number 92. The 52 was placed in the White Pass Roundhouse, where it was cleaned and painted. Afterwards, it sat on display at the shops. Photos with admirers of the 52 was a common occurrence. In 1969, the 52 and its tender were sitting next to the roundhouse when it caught fire on October 15th and burned to the ground. The wooden deck of the tender was badly burned due to its proximity to the fire. The original plan for Project 52 was to move the locomotive into town, next to the Trail of 98 Museum. Instead, the 52 was moved across the street from the depot, beside the United Transportation Union building in 1971. Here it sat for 29 years. In the early 2000s, the 52 was moved back up to the shops, where it sat on various tracks, slowly rusting in the northern climate. In 2014, the 52 was given a fresh coat of paint and featured on the White Pass float in the 4th of July parade. Despite torrential rains during the parade, the White Pass float won Most Patriotic and Grand Prize. Following the parade, the 52 was moved to the tracks on the south side of the White Pass Depot, where it is now proudly displayed with other White Pass historical equipment. In the summer of 2019, Chuck Morse, a rail fan from Kasilof, Alaska, arrived in Skagway and began replacing the charred frame and deck of the 52's tender with new wooden beams. White Pass employees graciously helped with the heavy lifting. Limited time didn't allow Chuck to finish the job. The coronavirus in 2020 delayed the restoration even further. When complete, the tender will join Engine 52 on display next to the depot.